A weary waitress offered water to a man the world had already judged unworthy. Seconds later, his quiet gesture shattered the illusion of wealth around them. The chandeliers blazed with a brilliance that made the marble floors shine, as if they had been polished with liquid gold, and every mirrored wall reflected back a world that seemed untouched by worry or hunger. The air was warm and heavy, with the scent of butter and wine, a perfume of luxury that made even the quietest whisper feel important. Patrons filled the velvet booths and linen, draped tables, their clothes cut from the finest fabric, their jewelry glittering like small suns, their laughter rising and falling in careful patterns that spoke of confidence and calculation. Waiters moved between them with a grace that looked effortless, but was born of endless practice. Silver trays balanced perfectly, voices pitched low enough to flatter but never intrude. Every smile was polished, every gesture rehearsed, and behind the mask of hospitality was a quick glance, a subtle check, a judgment made in the space of a heartbeat. At the center of the room, a fireplace glowed beneath a gilded mirror, its flames throwing shadows across the crystal glasses that lined the bar, and yet even the fire seemed tamed, more decoration than warmth. Couples leaned close across their tables, whispering deals disguised as affection, and groups of men in tailored suits spoke loudly enough to be overheard, their words chosen not to inform but to impress. Money was not just the currency here, it was the language, the posture, the unspoken measure of worth. A woman in a gown of emerald silk laughed at a joke that was not funny, her laughter aimed not at her companion, but at the other tables nearby, a signal of belonging. The staff knew this dance well, for they were part of it even as they served it. Their eyes flicked to watches on wrists, to handbags placed on chairs, to the sharp gleam of cufflinks, and their movements shifted accordingly. To the man with the platinum tie clip they bowed slightly lower. To the woman with the diamond necklace they poured the wine more slowly, letting the label show. Each action was precise, each word delivered with the weight of performance, and the illusion held because no one dared to break it. To be here was to be seen, to be measured, to be judged, and no one wished to be found wanting. The restaurant itself was a stage, and the decor was its curtain. High arches framed the room, lined with dark wood that shone under layers of varnish, and the hush that followed each clink of crystal was like a well-rehearsed pause. Even the music, a string quartet hidden near the balcony, seemed to play not for beauty but for effect, every note falling into place like a pearl on velvet. To walk through those brass doors was to step into another world, one where struggle did not exist, and every face wore the same smooth confidence, though beneath it all lay the constant tension of competition. In this room of chandeliers and marble, no one was truly at ease, for every laugh, every glance, every word was part of a contest where only the wealthy could win. The heavy brass doors opened, and for a moment, the warm glow of the chandeliers seemed to falter, as if the very room hesitated to welcome the figure who stepped inside. He did not look like anyone who belonged in such a place, his jacket torn at the cuff, his boots scuffed and dulled with years of wear, his hair unkempt as though he had not thought to comb it before facing the world. The polished laughter and gentle clink of crystal glasses thinned to silence, replaced by the subtle rustle of silk gowns and the sharp whisper of surprise. Eyes lifted from plates of fine steak and delicate desserts, narrowed with quiet disbelief, widened with disdain. The restaurant had trained its patrons to expect perfection, and here was a man who broke the pattern with every step he took. He paused at the threshold, the city's cold air still clinging to him, and for a heartbeat he looked less like a guest and more like a shadow that had slipped past the velvet ropes. The hostess, tall and composed with her painted smile, froze at the sight of him. Her eyes darted to his frayed collar, to the mud-stained laces of his boots, then back to his face, where she found no apology, no shame. Her hand hovered over the reservation tablet, as if she might press a button to summon security, her body tilting forward to block his path. But something in his gaze stilled her. It was not defiance nor arrogance, but a calm, steady weight that held her in place. A look that seemed to strip away the glittering walls around her and remind her of something she could not name. Behind her, the murmur of the room began again. Hushed voices spilling with cruel curiosity. Who was he? How had he found his way in? Why was no one stopping him? A man in a navy suit whispered to his companion, his lips curling into a smirk, while a woman in pearls drew her shawl closer, as if the mere presence of the stranger might stain her. The waiters moved with uneasy speed, their polished rhythm disrupted, trays carried higher, eyes cast aside to avoid contact. No one wished to be seen watching, yet no one could look away. The stranger's presence was an unwelcome mirror, reminding them of a world they preferred to forget, a world of want and weariness that had no seat in this cathedral of wealth. The hostess cleared her throat, her voice crisp but uncertain. "Good evening, sir. May I help you?" The word "sir" slipped out by habit, though her tone bent beneath the weight of doubt. He nodded once, his voice rough, his words simple. "A table for one." The silence stretched. It was clear he had no reservation, no polished excuse for his intrusion. Her smile thinned, the edges of it brittle, and she tried once more to guide him back to the cold street. Yet his eyes held her still, quiet, patient, unyielding. With a breath she did not realize she was holding, she stepped aside, her hand gesturing stiffly toward the dining room. The stranger passed her without another word, leaving behind the scent of rain and the heavy silence of a room that no longer felt untouchable. The hostess walked quickly, her heels tapping against the marble floor like a warning bell, and the man followed in silence, his steps heavy but steady, his eyes moving slowly across the glittering room that had already judged him guilty of intrusion. Conversations had returned in fragments, but every word carried an edge, every laugh rang false, and every glance followed him as though he carried with him some invisible stain. A man in a tailored gray suit leaned back in his chair to watch, his lips curling in amusement, while his companion whispered behind a jeweled hand, her eyes bright with cruel delight. At another table, a woman in emerald silk turned her body slightly away, though she still stared in the reflection of the mirror behind her, unwilling to miss the spectacle of a stranger in rags, daring to cross their polished world. The hostess stopped at a narrow alcove near the kitchen doors, where the air was heavy with the scent of garlic and seared meat, where the noise of pots and clattering plates escaped each time the doors swung open. A small, unsteady table stood wedged against the wall, one leg shorter than the others so that it rocked with the slightest touch. It was the place reserved for those who did not matter, for walk-ins who had no name to offer, for guests who were expected to leave quickly and never return. She gestured stiffly, her smile a mask stretched thin, and said the words she had said to countless others, but tonight they sounded sharper. "This is all we have available." He nodded once, not looking at her, and lowered himself into the seat without complaint. The table wobbled, the surface shivering under the weight of the single water glass she set down before him. The sound of the kitchen doors banging open and shut was constant, a reminder of his place in this room of chandeliers and crystal. The hostess lingered a moment, waiting for him to change his mind, waiting for him to take the hint and walk back out into the night, but he remained still, his hands folded on the table, his face unreadable. At last she turned sharply, her heels striking the floor like a verdict, and left him alone with the noise of the kitchen and the cold stares of strangers. Whispers spread like ripples in a pond, soft at first, then sharper gathering force. "A homeless man," some said, their voices thick with disbelief. "A beggar," others muttered, lowering their eyes only to raise them again in quick glances filled with suspicion. The staff moved around him with careful precision, avoiding his gaze, their polished smiles faltering as they tried not to be caught staring. To the wealthy diners he was an intruder, a reminder of streets they hurried past, a disruption to the delicate order of their sanctuary. Yet the man sat quietly, unmoved by their judgment, his gaze steady as he watched the play of wealth and performance unfold before him. A lone figure at the worst table in the finest room. Clara moved through the dining room with the quiet rhythm of someone who had long since learned how to make herself small, how to glide without disturbing the delicate balance of wealth and pretense that filled the air. Her uniform was pressed but frayed at the edges, the white apron showing faint creases from too many washes, her black shoes worn thin at the soles from endless shifts. Her dark hair was pulled into a simple ponytail. No shine or glamour, only practicality. And her eyes, though soft and kind, carried shadows beneath them, the marks of sleepless nights and burdens too heavy for someone so young. She carried a tray with practiced steadiness, her hands firm, though her fingers showed the faint tremor of fatigue. And as she crossed the floor, she felt the stares of patrons who did not see her as a person, but as part of the furniture that served them. When she reached the small table tucked near the kitchen doors, she paused, surprised to see who sat there. The man looked out of place, his jacket worn, his boots cracked, his face rough with stubble, and yet there was a stillness about him that unsettled her. The other servers had already decided to keep their distance, some whispering at the bar that he had wandered in from the street, some laughing quietly that he would not last through the appetizer before being escorted out. But Clara did not turn away. Her mother had once told her that respect costs nothing and can mean everything, and so she approached him with the same composure she gave the city officials at table 6 or the jewel-draped women by the fireplace. She set down a glass of water in front of him, the crystal catching the light of the chandelier, and for a moment the room seemed to pause. It was such a small act, an automatic gesture of service, yet in the hush of murmurs and judgment it felt like defiance. Diners who had been smirking grew silent, their eyes shifting between the waitress and the man no one wanted to claim. The hostess, watching from her stand, pressed her lips into a thin line, disapproval flashing across her carefully painted face. But Clara ignored them, her movement steady, her voice quiet, but even as she said, "Good evening, sir. My name is Clara. I'll be taking care of you tonight." The man looked up at her then, his eyes clear and sharp behind the tired lines of his face, and for an instant she felt seen in a way she rarely did. Not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as a person. The corner of his mouth lifted in the faintest of acknowledgments. Not quite a smile, more a recognition, and she felt her own breath steady. Around them the restaurant adjusted, the whispers softening into puzzled silence, the performance of wealth unsettled by something as simple as a waitress offering water to a man who looked like he belonged anywhere but here. The glass of water stood on the shaky table, catching the glow of the chandelier above, and though it was such a simple thing, the act itself seemed to hang in the air like a challenge. For a heartbeat nothing moved. Not the waiters who froze mid-step with their trays balanced, not the diners who leaned just slightly forward in their seats, their words dying on their tongues, not even the hostess who stood near her podium with her smile stiff and brittle. It was as though the entire room had inhaled at once and forgotten how to breathe again. Respect had been offered to the man who least deserved it in their eyes, a man who wore no tailored suit, no polished shoes, no glittering watch, only the signs of struggle written across his clothes and his face. Clara, standing beside him with her hands folded neatly against her apron, felt the weight of those stares pressing hard against her back. She had not done anything unusual, only what she had been trained to do, and yet the silence told her that to everyone else she had broken some unspoken rule. A man like this was supposed to be ignored, pushed aside, hurried out the door, not welcomed with dignity. She forced her eyes to stay on his, steady and calm, though her heart thudded nervously. For a long moment he did nothing, only looked at her with that quiet, searching gaze, and then slowly, almost deliberately, he reached into his pocket. The sound was almost nothing. Fabric brushing against fabric. Yet it might as well have been thunder. Every eye followed the movement of his hand, every whisper rising to the edge of speech before falling back into tight throats. Some expected him to fumble out a crumpled bill, Others braced for a pathetic gesture, a plea for mercy, a sign that he truly did not belong. The man's fingers disappeared into the worn jacket, lingered there for a beat longer than seemed necessary, and then began to draw something out. The air grew thick with tension. The string quartet in the balcony faltered for a second before recovering, their notes stumbling across the silence. What emerged was not what anyone expected. In his rough hand gleamed a sleek rectangle, black and unmistakably heavy, a credit card of the kind that whispered power without a word. The nearest diners gasped, the recognition instant, for this was no ordinary piece of plastic, but the kind of card reserved for the rarest few, the kind that spoke of limitless wealth and silent privilege. The contradiction struck them hard. A man who looked like a beggar holding a key to a kingdom none of them could reach without invitation. Clara's breath caught, though she kept her expression still, her training holding firm even as the room seemed to tilt around her. He placed the card on the table as casually as if it were nothing at all, the black surface catching the chandelier's light. The room remained frozen, every pair of eyes locked on that single impossible object, and in that moment, the world of wealth and the world of want collided, leaving everyone uncertain which one he truly belonged to. The card rested on the shaky table, its black surface smooth and heavy, and though it was small, it seemed to command the entire room. The man's rough hand withdrew, the calloused fingers folding quietly into his lap, leaving behind that single gleam of power, a rectangle of titanium that few had ever touched and fewer still had ever owned. For a heartbeat no one moved, no one even breathed, as if the chandeliers themselves had dimmed to watch. The hush that followed was deeper than silence, the kind that makes every tick of a watch, every clink of a fork, sound deafening. The whispers began at the edges, faint and scattered, a ripple of disbelief moving from table to table. A centurion card, someone mouthed, their voice barely audible but carrying like fire through dry grass. Another diner shook his head as though to clear it, muttering that it could not be real, that such a thing in the hands of a man dressed like a vagrant was impossible. Yet the card lay there, undeniable, catching the glow of crystal light, its presence as sharp and cutting as a blade drawn in a crowded hall. The mockery that had filled the air only minutes before was gone, swallowed whole by confusion and shock. Clara felt her throat tighten as she looked down at it, her tray balanced against her hip, her heart thudding with the knowledge of what it meant. She had seen wealthy guests pay with gold cards, with sleek metal ones, with slips of cash folded carelessly, as though the amount did not matter. But never this. This card was a symbol, an entry to a level of wealth most could not even imagine, a key to doors she had only ever passed on her way to work. She lifted her eyes to the man again, and found him watching her, not smug, not defensive, only calm, as though revealing this secret was no more important than setting down a spoon. Across the room, the hostess gripped her podium tighter, her knuckles pale against the lacquered wood. The manager, standing near the bar, froze mid-laugh, his mouth hanging open as his eyes locked on the table near the kitchen. The patrons shifted in their seats, discomfort heavy in their movements, their certainty unraveling thread by thread. They had been so quick to sneer, to dismiss, to cast judgment with a single look, and now they were faced with a man who defied all their assumptions, a man whose appearance had told one story, and whose card told another entirely. The quartet's music faltered again, one note sharp against the harmony before steadying, and in that brief mistake, the tension broke just enough for the whispers to rise louder. Who is he? Why is he here? What game is he playing? Clara straightened, her face composed, her voice quiet but steady, as she asked if he wished to order. And though her words were simple, they carried through the silence like a bell, reminding everyone that the stranger had not come to beg, but to dine, and perhaps to reveal far more than anyone in that gilded room was prepared to face. Beneath the flicker of chandeliers and the polished gleam of marble floors, the man who looked like he belonged to the streets sat calmly at the worst table in the finest restaurant, as though he had every right to be there, and in truth, Did. His name was Adrian Cross, a man whose fortune stretched across continents, a billionaire who owned towers of glass that pierced city skylines and companies that turned profits larger than the budgets of small nations. He was 42 years old, and in his world he was a figure whispered about in boardrooms, a man who could tilt markets with a signature and bend negotiations with a single glance. Yet here in his faded jacket and scuffed boots, his beard rough with days of deliberate neglect, he was invisible, just another shadow in the corner, dismissed by the very people who ate under his roof. Adrian had built an empire of steel and glass, of luxury hotels and flagship restaurants, of companies whose names graced magazine covers and corporate reports. Yet all of it left him curiously hollow. Wealth surrounded him like an armor, keeping away not just enemies but sincerity, until every smile that reached him had been rehearsed, and every laugh had been purchased by obligation. It was why he came here in disguise, why he shed the polished skin of the billionaire to become a stranger in plain sight. He was not here for the food, though the steak was the best his chefs could prepare, nor the wine, though the bottles in the cellar were worth more than cars. He was here to search for the one thing he could not buy: honesty, the rarest currency in a world flooded with counterfeit kindness. Each time he performed this ritual, he discovered truths that reports and audits could never reveal. The way staff treated a guest they thought unimportant spoke louder than any financial statement. The way managers dismissed or demeaned revealed more than numbers on a ledger. He watched for those small moments when the mask slipped, when the polished act faltered, when true character broke through the surface. Tonight it had happened in the quietest of ways, with a simple glass of water placed in front of him by a waitress with tired eyes. Clara had seen more than a shabby jacket and cracked boots. She had seen a man and chosen respect when no one else had. He studied her as she moved back into the room, graceful though weary, her shoes worn, her shoulders heavy with burdens he did not yet know. She had not flinched when the black card touched the table. She had not joined the whispers or sought approval from the watchful manager. She had simply done her job with dignity. Adrian felt something stir within him, a reminder of the boy he once was in a small Ohio town, before the boardrooms and skyscrapers, before the world learned to bow when he entered. Clara did not know it yet, but she had passed a test, and her simple act of kindness had set in motion a chain that would change both of their lives forever. Gregory Hale spotted the man at the corner table, and the sight made his jaw tighten, his smile freezing mid-sentence as he excused himself from a group of wealthy patrons he had been charming. His polished shoes clicked sharply against the marble as he cut through the dining room, his tailored suit too tight across his shoulders, his slicked back hair gleaming under the chandelier's light. The staff who saw him coming moved quickly out of his way, trays held higher, eyes darting aside, for they all knew that look, the simmering anger of a man who thrived on control and detested anything that disrupted the illusion of perfection he had built. He stopped at the wobbly table near the kitchen doors, his shadow falling over Clara as she stood beside it, her hands folded neatly, her eyes steady despite the tension rising around her. "What do you think you're doing?" Hale hissed, his voice low enough to hide from the diners nearby but sharp enough to cut through the air like broken glass. His eyes flicked to the man in the faded jacket, then back to Clara, his lips curling into a sneer. "We do not serve trash. Do you understand me? This is a 5-star establishment, not a soup kitchen." Clara's breath caught in her throat, but she held her ground, her fingers tightening against her apron. "He asked for water, sir, so I gave him water," she said, her voice even though her heart pounded. Hale leaned closer, his words dripping with disdain. "You are here to make this place shine, to keep the paying guests happy, not to waste time on strays who wander in off the street. You embarrass the restaurant when you lower yourself to their level, and you embarrass me." His face flushed red, his anger blooming hotter with every word, the veins in his neck tightening as he let his contempt spill freely. Adrian sat in silence, his rough hands folded loosely on the table, his black card resting in plain sight. He did not flinch. He did not interrupt. He simply watched, his gaze cool and unwavering, every word searing into him not as insult, but as evidence. The manager had revealed his truth, the polished charm stripped away to expose the cruelty beneath. Adrian's eyes flickered once to Clara, noting the way she held herself firm despite the humiliation, the way she kept her dignity even as her superior tried to strip it from her. Around them the restaurant's hum continued, but the nearest tables caught fragments of Hale's venom, and their discomfort showed in darting glances and forced laughter. Clara felt the weight of those stares, but she refused to bow, answering softly, "All guests deserve respect, sir." The words were simple but defiant, and Hale's eyes narrowed with fury, his mouth opening to lash back, only to pause when Adrian finally lifted his gaze to meet his. That single look, cold and sharp as steel, silenced the manager more effectively than any argument could. Hale straightened, adjusting his jacket, his eyes flickering nervously between the stranger's face and the card on the table, though he still masked his unease with a brittle smile. Clara exhaled slowly, relief and fear mingling in her chest, while Adrian sat unmoved, a silent judge recording every detail, his expression promising that the reckoning had only just begun. Adrian leaned back in his chair, the faintest trace of calm on his face, and when Clara returned with the menu, he did not glance at the cheaper items. He did not hesitate or stumble as a man in rags might have been expected to do. Instead, his finger landed directly on the most extravagant choice, the Emperor's cut steak, a dish so indulgent it was often ordered only for spectacle. His voice was steady as he spoke, low but certain. "I'll have the Emperor's cut, medium rare, and a glass of the 1998 Cheval Blanc." The words traveled across the silence like stones cast into a pond, rippling through the staff who hovered at a distance, and the diners who strained to hear. Clara's breath caught for a moment, her eyes flicking to the price printed on the menu, a number that could cover her rent for 2 months. But she recovered quickly, smoothing her voice into the same calm tone she offered every guest. "Of course, sir," she said, and she wrote it down with a hand that did not tremble. Gregory Hale, still lingering near the bar with narrowed eyes, stiffened when he heard the order, his lips parting in disbelief. He whispered harshly to a passing waiter, who hurried to the register to confirm, but Clara continued her work without faltering. She keyed the order into the system, the black card number added with a swipe, and within seconds the approval flashed back, cleared without question. No delay, no issue. The staff who had been waiting for the system to reject it were left swallowing their pride, their certainty collapsing under the undeniable truth. Whispers stirred again among the diners, less mocking now and more uncertain, their judgment cracked by the reality that the man they had dismissed might not only belong here, but might outrank them all. Some tried to laugh it off, claiming anyone could borrow such a card, while others leaned closer to their companions, murmuring theories about hidden fortunes and eccentric heirs. Yet none of them could erase the fact that the charge had passed as smoothly as silk, and the stranger in tattered clothes now held their unsteady respect. Clara returned to the table with fresh silverware, her movements graceful, her eyes calm, though inside she felt the tension buzzing around her like electricity. She poured his water without spilling a drop. She adjusted the linen napkin at his side, and when she spoke her words were measured, free of the false sweetness the others would have forced. "Your order will be out shortly, sir," she said, and her tone carried the dignity of someone who refused to bend to gossip or fear. Adrian's gaze lingered on her for a moment, not long enough to draw attention, but long enough for him to note the courage it took for her to stand steady while the room tried to crush her. In her tired eyes he saw something rare, a spark of integrity untouched by the weight of arrogance that filled the room. He gave a single nod, quiet, almost imperceptible, but it was a gesture that meant more than words. The staff looked away, chastened by their own arrogance, but Clara did not lower her head. She continued her work, unaware that her simple dignity had just carved her place in the memory of the man she served, a man who had come hunting for truth and had found it in her. Clara left the dining room for a moment, slipping into the narrow hallway that led to the service station, and the noise of clinking glasses and polished laughter faded behind her. She leaned against the wall and let out a slow breath, her fingers pressing into her apron as though she could hold herself together by sheer force. She thought of the order she had just placed, a meal worth more than her monthly rent, and the strange man who had spoken it with calm certainty, and for a fleeting second she let herself imagine what life would be like if money were not a chain around her neck. The thought vanished as quickly as it came, chased away by the memory of a stack of bills waiting on the kitchen counter of her small apartment, each one stamped with red notices that seemed to grow heavier with every passing day. Her younger brother Kevin was only 17, but his lungs had aged before the rest of him, each breath a battle won against the disease that had marked him since childhood. The medications that kept him alive came in bottles that emptied too quickly, their refills costing more than she could ever manage on her own. Insurance had reached its limit years ago, leaving her to pick up the weight with whatever job she could hold, and the restaurant, though unforgiving, paid more than anything else she could find. She had traded her own college dreams for double shifts, late nights, and mornings that began before the sun, and though exhaustion clung to her like a shadow, she carried it without complaint because Kevin needed her. Her shoes told the story better than words, the soles worn smooth from endless hours pacing the dining room floor, the leather cracked, the shine long gone. She had patched them once with glue, promising herself she would buy a new pair when tips were better, but each time she saved enough, another bill appeared, another prescription, another doctor's appointment that drained her savings like water slipping through her hands. Even her uniform, though clean, carried faint threads of wear, seams pulled tight from too many washes, fabric thinned at the edges. Yet she wore it with pride, because the job was her lifeline, and without it she and Kevin would sink into a world she dared not picture. There were nights when fear gnawed at her, when she lay awake listening to her brother's uneven breathing in the next room, praying he would make it to morning, praying she would make enough to pay for the next treatment. Some mornings she wept quietly in the shower, where Kevin could not hear, washing away the tears before she tied her hair back and painted on the small smile expected of her. But even as her spirit bent beneath the weight, it never broke, for kindness was the one thing she refused to surrender. So when she placed water before a man others scorned, when she addressed him with the respect denied to him by everyone else, she was not performing for approval, she was simply being herself. Clara's world was fragile and weary, yet her compassion remained unshaken. The one part of her that hardship could not touch, the quiet strength that defined her, even as everything else threatened to fall apart. Adrian sat quietly at the shaky table, his plate now half cleared, the empty glass glinting in the chandelier's glow, and though his face betrayed no emotion, his eyes missed nothing. He had watched Gregory Hale glide across the dining room with his false charm, laughing too loudly at wealthy jokes, bowing too deeply before men who waved him away, then snapping like a whip at the staff once their backs were turned. Adrian noted how quickly the smiles faded when Hale drew near, how waiters stiffened when his hand landed on their shoulders, how one young busboy nearly dropped a tray when Hale hissed an order through clenched teeth. The performance for guests was polished to perfection, but the truth lay in those cracks, in the fear that tightened the faces of those forced to serve under him. It was near the register where Adrian first caught it, the hurried exchange between Hale and a server whose hands shook as she presented a slip. Hale leaned close, his voice low but sharp, and Adrian could just make out the words, "The numbers don't match, adjust it, no one will know." The waitress nodded quickly, her cheeks pale, and keyed into the system with trembling fingers. Adrian saw the faintest shake of Hale's head, not in disappointment, but in calculation, the kind of look a predator gives when the trap has worked exactly as planned. A second instance came not long after, Hale caught another staff member in the hallway, pressed a receipt into his chest, and whispered so harshly that Adrian could hear from across the room. "Round it down, hide the overage, it goes where I tell you." The boy nodded, eyes darting nervously toward the diners, before disappearing into the kitchen with the paper crushed in his hand. The manager smoothed his jacket and returned to the floor with a bright smile, as though nothing had happened. Adrian's jaw tightened, but he kept his calm mask in place. He had seen this pattern before. Numbers bent into shapes that served only one man. Receipts doctored until truth disappeared beneath neat columns of lies. It was not incompetence, it was control. And the fear on the faces of his staff told Adrian that this had been happening for some time. Fraud was not just a possibility, it was a certainty. And the whispers about the supply chain that reached his ears confirmed the sickness ran deeper than the dining room. He caught the name of a vendor spoken too quickly, Prime Organic, repeated twice in hushed tones. And though it sounded clean, he knew enough to recognize the weight of invention. Behind the polished mirrors and the sparkling glasses, something darker pulsed, like rot beneath a painted wall. This was not only theft from the till, it was deceit wound into the very arteries of the restaurant. Shipments and suppliers falsified, profits siphoned through ghosts. Adrian tapped his finger once against the table, a gesture small enough to be missed, but it marked the thought solid in his mind. Gregory Hale was not only cruel, he was corrupt, and the ledgers he protected so fiercely would hold the proof. The night had deepened, the music of the quartet softer now, the steady rhythm of cutlery and muted laughter weaving through the air. Yet at table 32, the silence was heavier than any sound. Adrian sat with the patience of a man who had learned to let moments stretch, his rough hands folded on the linen as though he had nowhere else to be, though inside his thoughts burned sharp and fast. He had seen enough to know corruption hid in plain sight. He had watched Hale's cruelty and the fear it carved into every waiter and busboy, and he had marked Clara's quiet strength through it all. She was different. He had felt it from the first moment she set down the glass of water without judgment, and now as she approached again, he noticed the faint tremor in her hand, though her face remained calm. Clara carried the bill tray with steady grace, her eyes flicking once toward the bar where Hale stood, laughing too loudly with a pair of councilmen, then back to Adrian, her steps measured, her breath shallow. She set down the tray, her movements routine, but beneath it her fingers left something folded, a small square of linen napkin pressed tight to hide its secret. For a moment her hand lingered, her knuckles white, then she withdrew quickly, retreating with a smoothness that almost convinced the room nothing unusual had happened. Adrian's gaze did not shift. He did not break the rhythm of the role he played, but his fingers brushed against the fabric and closed around it, pulling it silently into his lap. He waited until she had moved on, until her figure blended once more with the ebb and flow of the staff, before unfolding it under the cover of the table. The handwriting was hurried, tight with fear, but the words struck like a blade drawn across silk. Check the hidden books. 4 words, nothing more. But they carried the weight of desperation and the courage to defy a predator. He looked up and found Clara watching him from across the room, her eyes steady though her hands still trembled as she poured wine for another table. There was no plea in her gaze, no request for rescue, only resolve. A quiet determination that told him she understood the danger and had chosen to act anyway. Adrian felt something shift within him, a sharp certainty settling into place. She was not merely kind, she was brave, and bravery in the face of fear was rarer than any gem he had ever purchased. Around them, the restaurant continued its performance, the chandeliers casting their golden glow, the mirrors reflecting endless illusions, the wealthy patrons laughing at their own rehearsed wit. Yet between the two of them an alliance had formed, silent and unspoken, born not of power or wealth, but of truth. Adrian folded the napkin carefully and slipped it into his jacket, his face unreadable, but in his mind the decision was clear. Clara had lit a fuse with her trembling hand, and he would not let it burn alone. The rain had stopped by midnight, leaving the streets slick with a dull shine, and Adrian stood in the shadows near the service entrance of the restaurant that bore his name, no longer in the disguise of the beggar, but dressed with quiet precision, dark clothes that blended into the night. The corduroy jacket and scuffed boots were gone, folded neatly in a bag in the trunk of his car, replaced by plain gray coveralls that carried the logo of a cleaning company. The transformation was complete, not into the billionaire the world knew, but into another kind of ghost, the kind that slipped in unnoticed and left no trace. Beside him stood a woman with sharp eyes and clipped speech, an operative trusted by very few, her stride measured, her tools tucked neatly into a small black case that looked like nothing more than janitorial supplies. The service door clicked open with a key card procured hours earlier, and they stepped inside, the heavy scent of bleach and stale cooking oil clinging to the narrow hallway. The hum of refrigeration units filled the silence, broken only by the occasional drip of water from pipes that ran along the ceiling. Adrian pushed a mop bucket ahead of him, his posture hunched, his role rehearsed, while the woman checked corners with quick glances, her every move efficient and exact. They passed through the quiet kitchen, stainless steel counters gleaming under dim lights, and moved toward the manager's office tucked at the back like a hidden den. The door was locked, of course, with a keypad glowing faintly, a cheap camera above it blinking lazily. Adrian leaned against the wall, keeping watch, while the woman knelt with a calm focus that spoke of long practice. Within moments, she had looped the feed, the camera frozen on an empty hallway, and her fingers danced across the keypad with a bypass tool no larger than a pen. A faint click answered her work, and the door eased open without resistance. Adrian pushed the bucket forward, closing the door softly behind them, the air inside heavier, the smell of stale cologne and old paper lingering. The office was a shrine to ego. Framed photos of Hale shaking hands with politicians, golf trophies lined across a shelf, a glossy desk stacked with invoices and polished pens. Yet Adrian's eyes searched for something else, the details that did not belong, the space that hid the truth. It was the trophies that caught his attention, arranged too neatly, their bases dusted too carefully, and he saw at once the faint scuff on the wall behind them. Together they lifted the row aside, revealing the outline of a small safe embedded into the plaster. The operative worked with speed, her tools silent, her concentration unbroken. Adrian kept watch at the door, listening for the hum of the refrigeration units, the faint clang of pipes, the silence of a building at rest. A soft metallic click sounded, and the safe opened, its hinges whispering. Inside lay stacks of cash, a passport, and a black leather-bound book, its cover worn from handling, its pages filled with the kind of truth that men like Hale buried beneath layers of lies. Adrian lifted it carefully, the weight of it heavy in his hands, knowing this was the ledger Clara had risked everything to reveal. The black leather book lay open on the desk, its pages filled with neat handwriting and precise columns, but the numbers told a story far removed from the polished reports that Gregory Hale paraded before investors and executives. Adrian turned the pages slowly, his eyes sharp, his finger tracing the sums that bent and twisted in ways only fraud could explain. The amounts were staggering. Shipments billed from companies that did not exist, vendors with names that sounded wholesome and organic, but dissolved into nothing under scrutiny. Prime Organic Meats, Pure Valley Distributors, Greenleaf Imports, all fabricated with the same careful handwriting, all channels that funneled money out of the restaurant and into accounts that had no legitimate purpose. Beside the book sat a small black case that had been pulled from the safe, and inside lay a stack of flash drives, each one labeled in Hale's tidy script. Adrian inserted one into the portable reader the operative carried, and the screen lit with folders that mirrored the lies of the paper ledger. Dozens of encrypted files filled the drive, but even without breaking the locks, the structure revealed its intent. transactions duplicated under different names, invoices recycled across multiple suppliers, amounts split and reshuffled until the trail blurred into shadows. It was fraud woven with precision, not the clumsy theft of a desperate man but the systematic bleeding of an empire by someone who believed himself untouchable. Adrian felt the weight of disgust settle in his chest as he studied the records. Every dollar siphoned into those ghost accounts had been stolen not only from him, but from the integrity of the brand he had built. Patrons believed they were paying for excellence, for purity, for trust, and instead, they were served a product rooted in rot. The books told a darker truth as well. Hints that the meat supplied to the restaurant came not from the reputable vendors named in official reports, but from a condemned plant shut down months earlier, its operations tainted by violations severe enough to make headlines. Hale had buried that fact beneath layers of falsified invoices. But the handwriting, the repetition, the dates all betrayed him. Adrian could see it clearly. The ugly pattern shining through the mask of respectability. The operative photographed every page, her small pen camera flashing silently with each click, while another device copied the contents of the drives into a secure partition. She worked with calm efficiency, but even she shook her head once as the depth of the deception became clear. Adrian closed the book carefully, his jaw tight, his mind already moving toward the reckoning that would follow. He thought of Clara, her trembling hand leaving behind a warning on a napkin, her courage to speak when everyone else bowed under fear. She had been right. The empire that looked so elegant under chandeliers and polished marble was rotting from its foundation, poisoned by the greed of a single man who cared more for his own pockets than for the truth. Adrian slid the ledger back into the safe, wiped the handle clean, and locked it with a steady hand. But the knowledge remained, heavy and sharp. The evidence of corruption was his now, and it would bring Hale down. The city was still dark when Adrian stepped out of the service entrance. The black ledger pressed against his chest beneath his jacket. The copied drives secured in the operative's case. The night air was cool, heavy with the faint scent of rain still clinging to the streets. And for a moment, he stood in silence, his thoughts as sharp as the neon lights flickering across the empty sidewalks. He pulled out a phone, not the device the world associated with his empire, but the unmarked one, he used only for matters that required silence and secrecy. His thumb pressed the single number that mattered most in times like these, and after 2 rings, Arthur Pendleton's calm voice answered, though sleep still clung to the edges of his tone. Adrian wasted no time. His words were clipped, his voice low. The evidence is real. The ledgers are falsified, the suppliers are ghosts, the meat is poison, and Hale is behind all of it. Arthur's silence lasted only a breath before his steady control returned. "What do you need?" he asked. And Adrian could hear the faint sound of papers shuffling, of a pen clicking, as the man prepared himself. "Coordination with law enforcement," Adrian replied. "Immediate action before Hale wakes and destroys what he cannot hide." He told him about the drives, the book, the patterns that tied everything together, and Arthur's voice grew colder with every detail. By sunrise, the FBI and the Food Safety Commission would be ready, Arthur promised. But he warned Adrian to stay clear of the fallout. "You've done enough. Let the system handle the rest." Adrian listened, but he knew himself too well. He would not stay clear, not when the truth demanded a reckoning face to face. Still, one thing weighed heavier than even the evidence. Clara. He thought of her weary eyes, her trembling hands sliding the napkin across the table, her courage to act while fear choked everyone else. She was not just a witness but the spark that had lit the fuse, and Hale would not forgive that. If suspicion fell on her before the strike, her life could be torn apart. Adrian told Arthur to pull her name from payroll quietly, to erase traces that might tie her directly to the warning. He asked for protection, subtle but firm, someone to watch her apartment and ensure she and her brother were not harmed before the morning came. Arthur agreed, his tone measured but touched with a rare note of concern. "Consider it done," he said. And Adrian knew he would deliver. When the call ended, Adrian stood in the empty street, the horizon just beginning to pale with the first suggestion of dawn. The restaurant would open soon, its staff polishing glasses and lighting candles, its guests arriving with their endless hunger for prestige, unaware that judgment was already circling above. Hale would walk in expecting another day of control, but instead he would face the weight of law, the betrayal of his own ledgers, and the silent fury of the man he had tried to dismiss as trash. Adrian exhaled slowly, his resolve steady. This was no longer about profit or loss, no longer about reputation. It was about justice, about protecting the brave, and ensuring that truth replaced the lies that had poisoned his house. The morning sun had broken through the clouds by the time Adrian arrived at the restaurant, its golden light glinting against the glass facade that had been polished to perfection, as though it could disguise the rot inside. He stepped from the black car with calm precision, his suit pressed and flawless, the cut sharp enough to command attention before he even crossed the threshold. Gone was the faded jacket, the scuffed boots, the stubble that had marked him as no one of importance. In their place stood Adrian Cross as the world knew him, steel in his posture, authority in every movement, his presence so commanding that the hum of the street seemed to soften around him. Two men followed discreetly at his side, their dark coats concealing the badges of the law. But it was Adrian who drew every eye as he pushed open the ornate brass doors and stepped into the dining room. The chandeliers blazed overhead, the marble floors shone, the velvet booths stood ready for the brunch crowd that would soon arrive, yet all the staff who moved through the room froze at once. Their trays hovered midair, their polite smiles collapsed into open mouths, their rehearsed greetings faltered on their lips. The man they had watched the night before, the one they dismissed as a beggar in thrift store clothes, now stood revealed in the armor of his true self. Recognition struck them like a silent thunderclap. They knew the name. They had seen it etched into the glossy corporate reports, whispered with reverence in financial magazines. Adrian Cross, billionaire, owner of the chain, master of the very building they stood in. At the far end of the room, Gregory Hale appeared, his stride confident as he prepared to greet what he assumed was an investor or a dignitary, another powerful figure to charm with empty words. His smile widened, his hands extended, but then his eyes locked on Adrian's face and the color drained from his own. For a moment his expression crumbled, confusion wrestling with recognition, until the truth hit with brutal clarity. The man he had mocked, the man he had threatened to throw out, the man he had called trash, was the owner of everything around him. The room seemed to tilt as Hale stumbled over his words, his voice breaking into a stammer. "You. It was you." Adrian's gaze was cold, his eyes sharp as blades, and he did not offer a smile, not even the courtesy of a greeting. He walked past the frozen staff, his polished shoes striking the marble with steady rhythm, and came to rest at the same shaky table near the kitchen doors, the very seat where Hale had thought to bury him in humiliation. He placed his hand on the linen, his expression unchanging, and said evenly, "I had a meal here last night. It was enlightening." The words rang clear across the room, a quiet rebuke more devastating than any shout. Hale swallowed hard, his polished act stripped bare, and for the first time the staff saw the cracks in his power. The morning storm had broken, and the reckoning stood before them. The sound of the doors opening again broke through the heavy silence, and all eyes turned as two dark SUVs pulled to the curb outside, their engines low and steady, their arrival deliberate. The first agents entered quietly, their presence marked not by noise, but by the weight of authority they carried. Jackets plain, badges clipped, movements crisp. The dining room, prepared for another morning of carefully staged elegance, now felt more like a courtroom, each chandelier casting its light like a spotlight upon the guilty. Gregory Hale's smile had already cracked when Adrian revealed himself, but now it vanished entirely as the agents crossed the floor and stopped at his side. One leaned forward, his voice level and firm. "Gregory Hale, we need to speak with you regarding ongoing federal investigations." Hale stuttered, his face paling, sweat rising on his forehead, though the room was cool. He looked wildly around, as though the patrons or staff might rescue him, but none moved, none dared. Adrian remained at the table near the kitchen doors, the same place Hale had tried to bury him in humiliation, his calm gaze never wavering. One of the agents produced a folder and opened it on a nearby table, displaying photographs of invoices, digital records, and stills from the very ledger Hale had thought hidden. Each page was damning, each figure precise, the lies laid bare for all to see. Hale shook his head, muttering protests, but the words rang hollow in the face of undeniable proof. "You doctored receipts, falsified suppliers, and laundered money through ghost companies," the agent continued, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned room. "And you knowingly purchased condemned goods for profit, endangering lives for your own gain." The staff gasped, their faces showing both shock and grim recognition, for many had suspected but never dared to speak. Clara stood near the bar, her apron clutched in nervous fingers, her eyes wide as the truth she had hinted at was now spoken aloud. Hale turned desperately to Adrian, his words frantic. "You don't understand. This was business. It was survival. I kept the numbers high. I made the place shine." His pleas cracked, his voice trembling under the weight of what he faced. Adrian rose slowly from his seat, his expression steady, his presence filling the space without effort. He walked toward Hale, each step measured, and when he spoke his words cut through the noise with absolute clarity. "You believed my empire was built on polish and deception, but you were wrong. It was never about chandeliers or marble floors. The true strength of what I have built lies in people like Clara, people who choose integrity when fear demands silence. And Indades." Hale's mouth opened as if to argue, but the clink of handcuffs closed around his wrists silenced him. The staff watched in stunned quiet, as the manager who had ruled them through fear was led away, his protests fading into nothing. Clara felt tears sting her eyes, not of sadness but of release, as Adrian's gaze lingered on her with quiet acknowledgement. The reckoning had come, swift and just, and with it the truth that kindness and courage, not arrogance, would define the empire from this day forward. The restaurant was quiet again, the storm of agents and accusations having passed, leaving only the soft clink of glasses being reset and the hushed voices of staff who could hardly believe what they had seen. The chandeliers still glowed, the marble still gleamed, but the air felt different, lighter, as if the building itself had been stripped of a poison it had carried too long. Adrian stood at the center of it all, his presence commanding but no longer hidden behind disguise, his gaze resting on Clara, who lingered near the service station with her hands folded tightly, unsure if she was allowed to breathe freely now that the weight of Hale's shadow was gone. He walked toward her, and the room seemed to draw a collective breath, for every eye was on them. Adrian stopped in front of her, his voice calm but carrying the authority that no one could mistake. He told her that the so-called debt Hale had used to chain her was erased, null and void, nothing more than a lie. The relief that crossed her face was quiet but deep, her shoulders loosening as though a weight she had carried for months had finally been lifted. Then he went further, his words steady, explaining that a medical trust had been established in her brother's name, fully funded, permanent, so that she would never again have to choose between rent and medicine, between her future and his survival. Clara felt tears spill before she could stop them, her hand rising quickly to her mouth, the enormity of the gift too much to contain. But Adrian was not finished. He spoke not just to her but to the staff who lingered in the corners, waiting, listening. He declared that the future of his empire could not be built on marble floors or rare wines alone, but on dignity, on honesty, on the kind of courage Clara had shown when she risked everything for truth. With the same calm certainty he had used to order his meal the night before, He announced that Clara would no longer serve tables, but would serve the very heart of the company as Director of Cultural Integrity, charged with ensuring that no employee and no guest would ever again be humiliated or silenced the way she had been. Gasps rippled softly through the room, but Clara could only stare at him, her lips parting, her voice lost in disbelief. He extended his hand, steady, patient, and she took it with trembling fingers, the warmth of his grip grounding her in the reality of what had just been spoken. Together they walked back to the small table near the kitchen doors, the one where she had first offered him water, and where whispers had once marked him as a beggar. They sat across from each other, not as waitress and patron, not as servant and master, but as equals, bound by a moment of courage that had rewritten both of their paths. Around them the staff watched, with quiet awe, the final image, clear and undeniable. Dignity had been restored, and a new legacy had begun. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.